I just wanted, before we begin, we just wanted to start by saying thank you for the opportunity to come down and speak with you all this morning. It means a lot to us to be able to share this work and the collaborations that we have with the Alliance, the Seattle Police Department, the King County Sheriff's Office, with so many different people. And it's cool to come down here this morning and see so many people that I've known for a long time. I see friends from the city of Spokane, her family renewal shelter. So we're excited to come down and just share a little bit about what we've been doing. And part of this today is talking about some really, difficult subjects, some difficult stories. I know it's a difficult thing to do when you're eating breakfast, but it's incredibly important. So we're going to take a deep dive this morning into risk and threats and some of the things that we see and the importance of doing this work really well. We're just excited to be here.
The of your emergency?
Is that your mother screaming in the bathroom?
Yeah. They just tried to choke me. This is not the first time. Get away from me. No.
Any weapons in the home?
They're in the vehicle. Are you telling me? Yes, fine. They're fine, okay?
You want me to talk to him? I want to help you.
No, it's not helping me. Let me talk, please.
Hello? Hello?
I just shot my wife.
You just shot your wife?
Yes.
Is she still breathing?
No.
Of your emergency?
So, historically, we've been doing this since the early 70s, right? Washington was one of the first states to have domestic violence laws to respond to this terrible scourge. And I feel like it's part of it's definitely part of my life. I grew up in a home with domestic violence. I grew up in Seattle. I was born in 1971. And so domestic violence for me has always been something that I've seen on a daily basis. And I can tell you what it was like growing up to have law enforcement respond to the home and not do anything. And in my little mind, I thought that nobody cared. And the laws that were passed in the late 70s and the mid to late 80s were all designed to change that response, to change the culture surrounding how we responded to domestic violence. It was mandating response. It was particularized, saying what police had to do, what courts had to do, what prosecutors had to do. Mandatory arrests, the creation of protection orders. They've only been around since the 80s. I mean, when you think about that, in my lifetime, protection orders were created. Domestic violence treatment came around there. And then things changed. In the 2000s, we had creation of more felony crimes, fatality reviews, new police policies, laws that protected victims and rent and the word advocate privilege. And then in the 2000s, more advancement. Things like strangulation, harsher sentences for recidivists, risk assessment. So we've done all of these things over time, and we've always been motivated by tragedy. So if you come to the King County Courthouse, this is an old picture from it. You come to the King County Courthouse, you come to my unit, the second floor of the King County Courthouse, there's a plaque that remembers the Blackwell murders. multiple women who were executed inside the King County Courthouse during a family law proceeding with a firearm by a man who had trafficked his wife from the Philippines. It was 25 years ago. We have a plaque there, we do a memorial every year. That led to enormous change in Washington. And everybody in this room is familiar with what happened in Pierce County. But that's not the only thing. There have been these cases that have taken a hold of the community and brought about change. Rebecca Griego, when she was murdered while at work at the University of Washington by her boyfriend / stalker, Jonathan Rowan. To more cases from Pierce County. A 10-minute drive from here, I believe it's Verde Elementary School. And Jennifer Paulson was murdered by her stalker, who was subject to an order where he didn't have to turn in his firearms. And he went to the school where Jennifer taught disabled students, and he murdered her in front of the students. And her father, Ken, and some people in this room with me were at Barnett when the stalking protection order laws were signed years ago. And then, of course, just recently there was a case in King County, Rashid Mitchell, who executed his girlfriend, Tabitha Appling, who he had abused for years with a gun he was ordered to surrender that he wasn't supposed to have. It's a homicide case that my unit is prosecuting in the next 3 weeks. And anybody who's worked in law enforcement, the legal system in this room, has numerous cases, numerous deaths that they can talk about, these tragedies that have happened over and over again with guns, that have led to change, but not enough. The intersection of firearms and domestic violence, everybody knows, well, it's really risky to have any gun involved in any type of domestic violence. But I think we don't really know how bad it is. We know it's bad, but it's so catastrophically bad that I think we need to talk about it more this morning to truly understand it, to be motivated to do something about it. So, Chris, I'll turn these slides over to you, but when we really look at homicide over a long period of time, and there's been so many fatality reviews put out by the state coalition, report after report after report, death review after death review, that talks about the danger of firearms and domestic violence. Right? It is an obvious thing. And also, obvious not just for victims, but for law enforcement.
And to add to what Dave's saying is that I started doing this work with, I guess many people in this room, to start working on firearms surrender laws and how they're being implemented. And I thought I knew risk. You know, I thought I knew, I'd done felony DV work, I've done misdemeanor DV work, I thought I kind of knew what the risks were for victims. And once we started to figure out how are we going to convince stakeholders, how are we going to get people to join in our cause and convince our elected officials and convince judges, and especially convince the city council and the county council to give us money that this is worthy of something to look into, it's worthy of putting additional resources into. And when we dove into that data, I mean, I have to admit that Dave's a little more versed in the literature than I was, but it was terrifying. Reading these protection orders, I mean, as a prosecutor, you're seeing incident reports. Some of these protection orders show the entire history of abuse and violence, and it was really eye-opening for us as well. And it kind of changed the way that we thought about our approach. It was so compelling and so definitive, the research in this area, that we changed the approach of saying, like, hey, this is something we should put some money into, rather than like, what are you doing with your money that's more important than what we're doing right here? There are very few things that any of our offices do that's more important than proactively removing a risk factor like a firearm on the front end and reducing risk to victims. There's very few things that we do that is worth that money. So it's so much not more about getting the resources, it's about reallocation of resources if you don't have them as well. And as Dave mentioned, when you talk about, if you want to look at trying to reduce domestic violence homicides, and it's not something new that we've figured out. For 16 years, the Fatality Review Board has suggested in its report that to reduce homicides, you need to remove guns from abusers. we've had 2 recent police shootings in Seattle within the last month, this month. And Dave can maybe tell you more about the facts of those, but they were responding to DV calls. I mean, if you look at this chart, which I think is terrible, because you're 3 times more likely to be murdered responding to a domestic violence call than you are responding to a shots fired call or a suspicious person with a gun. And most of the 18% disturbances were probably domestic violence call-outs as well. And recent separation, as mentioned a little bit in the video, the reason it requires a new approach is because of the data we have on the first 6 months after a separation. Often a separation is created by a protection order or an arrest. So you have 45% of DV homicides occurring within 90 days of separation, 75% occurring within the first 6 months. And everybody who's worked on protection orders or dealt with protection orders, sometimes the continuances may last into 5 or 6 months. We just don't have that luxury when you look at the data. Only 13% of DV homicides occur outside of a year. So when you think about kind of criminal justice reform, the reform is trying to move resources to the front end to reduce risk rather than on the back end after the terrible things have happened.
Right, I think we would be remiss if we didn't mention, I believe it's Officer Jake Gutierrez was the Tacoma police officer who was murdered in a domestic violence response. What was it, a couple of years ago now? And there's a stereotype, right, of what a domestic violence offender is. Right? The most crude form of that stereotype is like the guy in the white beater t-shirt, right, who's hurting his wife, and it's just her problem, but he's a good guy, doesn't harm anybody else. It's a relationship dysfunction type of thing. So those stereotypes are insidious, right? And they permeate a lot of things in the criminal justice system. When you're talking about domestic violence murders, a lot of times we talk about those being crimes of passion. This person was an otherwise really good guy, but, he's jealous, kind of her fault. And so when she is dead, it's because, we just misunderstand him. He's a passionate person. In truth, what the literature says, and what anybody who does this work on a day-to-day basis knows, is that domestic violence offenders present a form of risk that is so substantial and so dangerous that these old stereotypes really must fall. They must be struck down. And so when you look at the research, and we're going to delve into a few things that are talking about this area. There was a study that was done by the University of Washington, Amy Bonomi, Mary Kernick, and a lot of other folks, looking at a couple of years of Seattle police data, 6,000 cases, really breaking those down and seeing what can we learn about these cases, what can we learn about male to female intimate partner violence events, and then we're going to do 2 years of follow-up. These are epidemiologists, right? This is high-quality studies. This is not lawyers doing a study, right? Lawyers shouldn't study anything. We should just do law. The strongest predictor of repeat domestic violence was the presence of a weapon. Right? Just the weapon alone in any incident report almost assures you of the fact that this will happen again. Like 83%. I mean, it's like a shocking number. And that's for non-physical. For physical, right, 72%. Right? When you just talk about when you're assured that an assault or some type of domestic violence is going to happen again, without question. That's not the only thing. This is Washington state data. Some of you may be familiar with the analytic arm of our state legislature, the Washington State Institute for Public Policy. I would encourage you to look at their website if you really want to take a deep dive into the analytic arm of the state legislature. They've actually been studying domestic violence for years. They look at hundreds of thousands of offenders across very large data sets. They cross-reference that with tens of thousands of others. And they have found repeatedly that domestic violence offenders, this is just like reality. They don't just hurt those in their family or household, but people outside their householders as well. They pose an even greater risk to public safety than we know of. So they're not, and it makes sense. Chris and I have talked about this a lot. If you are willing to hurt those you know and love, people that you love and you say you care about, typically don't have a problem hurting people you don't know and you don't care about. Your social norms are so reduced that if you're willing to use violence against people you know and you harm them, when you see somebody you don't know, typically you don't have a problem using violence as a tool. And the numbers say that's absolutely the case. So we have these huge, and this is 2007, they did these huge numbers, they cross-referenced it, they did it again, and this is the result. So they do these weighting scales, and they say, okay, what's the most predictive for future violent or felonious behavior? So the worst crimes that are going to be committed in our community. And they rank all of it. They're looking at sex offenses, they're looking at homicide, they're looking at felony assault, robbery, kidnapping. What do they find? So here's robbery. You get a whole like big weight of 5 points in this scale that they do. It's really valuable. It's much more predictive than say a juvenile conviction or a felony sex offense. Here's domestic violence. So this is across hundreds of thousands of offenders. It is orders of magnitude greater. They're not even the same type of person. The guy who robs a bank is fundamentally less violent, less risky, a better person to hang out with, right, than a DV person. A DV person statistically is like horrific, and not just for violence here, but if you look at for all crime, it's +6 down at the bottom, and that's what people miss. So if you're a DV person, you're not just willing to be violent with people you know and love, and not just willing to be violent, you're just willing to commit crime, period. They repeated this study again in 2011. I think they've done it 3 times now. This is the bottom line, right? Domestic violence is the single greatest predictor of future violent crime, period. It's not a question. This is fact. It's not gang members. Oh, it's not even the future violent crime. Then you look at just kind of recidivism trends generally. The state broke this down. They examined 155,000 offenders, and they found certain patterns among those offenders. More criminal history than anybody else. Much higher rates of criminal recidivism. I mean, 20% across like hundreds of thousands of offenders is such a massive number. 4 times more likely to be high violent than the normal population. Significantly higher recidivism rates. When you really take a deep dive on who offenders are, that stereotype of the guy in the white theater t-shirt, this terrible stereotype, has to be struck down. We have to do away with it. And that really makes you appreciate the connection between domestic violence, recent separation that Chris was talking about, and firearms. This is the lowest of low-hanging fruit, is to respond to these individuals, to remove weapons. It is the easiest way to stop horrible violence in a community and stop all of these tragedies that we continue to have. When we have these tragedies, we respond typically by getting together, joining with the victim's family, and going to our state legislators and asking for change, and then going to Olympia over and over again to ask for our laws to be rewritten. We could just make the law better. Everything would be okay. I've done that for a long time. Chris has done that, and so many in this room have done that. Every one of those young women that we showed you earlier, all of them led to new laws. This is another one. That tattoo is Megan Smith. Megan was actually not a domestic violence victim. She was the best friend of a domestic violence victim. And that is the arm of her dad, Anthony. And he has such a close relationship with Megan. She was such an amazing human being. There were 1,000 people who turned out for her funeral. It's a homicide case that I handled last year. Megan was house sitting for her friend, a domestic violence victim, who was also, they had gone to high school together. They were both college students. Family was out of town. Megan's taking care of the house. Abuser comes over. He was ordered to surrender his weapons. He was ordered to go to treatment. He was ordered to do all sorts of things. The system totally failed. And he executed Megan with a firearm in her friend's home because he wanted to send a message of abuse to his victim. So he decided the best way to do that would be to kill her best friend. That's catastrophically awful. So Anthony and his wife Julie and their dozens of family and friends came with me to Olympia, and we went and we changed the laws. And we got to watch Renee and everybody from the Alliance change dozens of laws this year. And I guess I would suggest to you that those things are great and they're advancements. But unless you give life to what those laws say, it doesn't matter. And then we'll just come back in a couple of years, we'll do another summit, and we'll talk about what we should be doing instead of actually doing it. And I think that leads to our discussion and kind of our processing. Chris, I'll turn this over to you, because we went through a lot of struggle trying to figure out what to do here. What do you do?
And to the point about Megan, the victim, it always reminds me when Dave talks about that, about just the far-reaching consequences of a single death. You have 1,000 people at her funeral, you have friends and family, but not just those people, but the sense of security in the community. And when you think about how many DV homicides there are and how it's part of our culture, unfortunately, between 2003 and 2013, there were more women murdered by their intimate partners than combat deaths in Iraq and Afghanistan during that same period of time, U.S. combat deaths. And thinking about how that has such a long-term impact on who we are as a culture and how much we need to do about changing that and not forgetting how much of an impact it is on everyone, not just...
Because you served, Chris, right?
Right.
And you were deployed then. And the consequences of people returning from combat and what that has meant to the community, and we don't take the same approach with this.
Right, and seeing that's why I used that quote, because I saw the impact of individuals and how that one death rippled through the community and just upsetted people's sense of security and identity. After years, advocates, groups like the Alliance for Gun Responsibility, community members, finally, we think it happened all of a sudden, but they're saying finally, we passed these things, passed HB 1840. And we had no funding for implementation with that when it was passed. There was really no understanding or agreement between jurisdictions about whose responsibility it is to enforce that HB 1840, and no mechanism, of course, of enforcement. So we convened a work group in 2016, late 16, and mostly worked throughout 2017. And what Judge Levinson who headed that up, and many of the people in this room were here. I know Renee was here, Dave was here, and a lot of the people on the Firearms team were part of that work group. And it was an incredible struggle because we had to deal with all of these systemic jurisdictional barriers, funding barriers, to implement something that wasn't really like criminal prosecution. It was on the civil side, it was completely outside of but we knew the risk and we knew that we had to do something about it from a public safety perspective. And I remember, it's kind of a watershed moment. Dave kind of doesn't like me telling the story, but Dave came in one time after we'd been in meetings for like a year, sometimes twice a week for an hour and a half. It was a lot.
He's a lot.
And Dave came in and he was kind of, I don't know, he was in a mood. Like his body language was a little different. He probably doesn't remember this, but he kind of puts his computer down, he slams the lid, because we just had a conversation about how our budget proposal was rejected. They might give us some consulting money, but we didn't need consulting money because we were the consultants. We had a plan. And things kind of fell through, and then Dave just sat down and said, well, we're going to do something. And we don't have money, we don't have resources, and I don't have any extra bodies, and you don't have any extra bodies, but we're going to just show up with these review calendars. So after every issue was a protection order, there was a review calendar set where the court would essentially make an inquiry, at best, whether they were in compliance. Most people didn't show up at those hearings, so we just decided to go. We had no idea what to expect, we had no idea what was going to happen, but we just figured we had to do something. We were kind of, that anxiety level had gone so high, and the anxiety was from this. We'd spent a year terrifying each other about the risk and the stats and the data, while simultaneously being acutely aware that we were doing nothing. And that essentially those orders were being issued every single day, and nobody was telling the victims essentially like, hey, don't worry about it. Nobody's following up on this. I know that you think this order means something, it doesn't mean anything. And that caused this sense of anxiety. And that was the watershed moment. We went to these hearings, and March 29, 2017, we just showed up, and the court was a little confused why there were like 4 prosecutors and advocates sitting in the back of the courtroom and wanted to know what was going on. But we sat there, and immediately there were 3 people that showed up on a calendar of 23, the civil calendar. And we're just, as prosecutors, we're like, that guy's lying, he's lying, I know he's not telling the truth. And we just walked out, and with a couple phone calls, we had 6 guns. Dave called, so one guy was a correctional officer, jail, and so when the correction officer supervisor gets a call from the chair of the domestic violence unit, wants to know where his guy's gun is, we get a call right back.
Right.
And he turned that gun in within that afternoon. We called one victim, maybe an hour after the hearing, and said, this is what the defendant said. He says, doesn't have any guns. And she's like, are you kidding me? They're right here. And we sent over Sergeant Kim to go pick them up. The third one was a guy who came in and said, I don't have any guns. He bashed the victim and said, I've never had any guns. He said his son was a Pierce County police officer, right? Or Pierce County Sheriff.
Which was a lot.
Which was a lot, yeah. And the court, but the situation the court was in is that there's no lawyers there. There's nobody representing the victim. There were no advocates there. It's just the judge and the defendant on a review calendar. And so whatever he says, she has no way, the court had no way of confirming what was going on.
Was he holding a baby?
He had brought a baby with him. He went all out to try to convince the court that he was a really nice guy. We executed a search warrant on his house a couple days later and recovered 7 firearms. And it doesn't sound like a lot of firearms. It was, I think, a total of 11 that we recovered off of that one calendar. There's 52 calendars a year. That was 20% of the firearms that were recovered the entire previous year by voluntary surrender. So we thought we're onto something.
Right. Charge that guy with perjury, charge him with multiple counts of unlawful possession, pull him into custody, and clearly lied to the court. It was a watershed moment for us to be able to do that. And I think more than anything, what we found, this is true in so many things, like our relationship that we had built from these work groups led by Judge Levinson, sponsored by the Alliance and others, the relationships that we had, everybody just wanted to do something. We were so tired of meeting and talking that we wanted to do something. And it felt good, right? It felt good to take action.
And so this is a clip that we have, which, and I think it encapsulates kind of the sense of confusion and apathy for these review calendars and how no one was really following it. And I'm not meaning to be critical of the people in this video, but when an investigative reporter looked at these review calendars, it was sad. Nobody was showing up. The courts were really just, what are we supposed to do? And this is kind of the way to set the tone of like where we were in early 2017.
In 2014, Washington legislators passed a law that was supposed to ensure that people served with protection orders actually turn over their guns. The law requires those people provide the court with a receipt showing that all firearms have been surrendered to police, or sign this declaration swearing they don't have any guns.
And they're saying there's an allegation that he possessed weapons.
But at this recent King County court hearing, the law proves as empty as the courtroom. On the door outside, 34 people who have not responded to weapons surrender orders are scheduled to appear before the judge to explain themselves. 34, but only 3 show up. King 5 reviewed this court database of 1,000 protection orders granted last year, in which firearm surrenders were required according to the 2014 law. In 47% of cases, the columns that should contain responses from alleged abusers are blank. Nearly half of the weapons surrender orders go unanswered. What do you think of that?
I think that's unacceptable. I see today's situation as playing Russian roulette with the lives of victims of domestic violence.
William Braun is a former federal prosecutor who now volunteers his time representing high-risk domestic violence victims. Cassie is one of his clients. He says the criminal justice system should punish abusers who don't comply with weapons surrender orders by finding them in contempt.
I have actually asked for that in court, and that has been denied.
Are judges being firm enough with these people to get them to respond?
I don't really think it's a question of the firmness of the judges. I don't think that's the issue.
Both the current and the past chief judges of the family court say they're committed to getting guns out of the wrong hands.
We know that firearms magnify the threat.
The judges say many of the accused may not have been served with a surrender order, a requirement before it can be enforced. For those that are served, they say contempt orders and arrests only work with the help of police and prosecutors, and a task force is studying that right now. And about the high number of no-shows at their firearms review hearings.
I don't think that's really unusual. I think maybe people would be surprised at how often people don't comply with court orders.
You know, there was a promise made to victims when the legislation was passed. And that was, not only will we issue a protection order to you, but we will get the guns out of the hands of your abuser. And that promise is not being kept.
And that's where we were, trying to figure out how to build compliance. And as I told the story earlier, that's where the test cases came in. That's where we went to the court and we decided to do something. And this, I put this slide in here just because me and David have been talking about this, like is that when we think about the incredible barriers to the Second Amendment, incredible legal barriers to enforcing these laws on the front end, which is before a crime has been committed in some cases. We have to remember, as Dave mentioned before, with protection orders and everything, we've been here before, right? The idea of a protection order in the beginning, when it was passed 30 years ago, was a staggering constitutional development. That you could get an ex parte order, you could have someone not have access to their children, removed from their home, without being heard in court. That was huge at the time. Mandatory arrest, removing discretion on arrest, and it was all built around that. The data that showed that you need to have separation for victim safety. There cannot be continued contact, and protection orders were one, and mandatory arrests were the other. And that resulted that, victim advocacy, the development of victim advocacy, the development of investigations, improved investigation techniques, and for victimless prosecutions, resulted in a 65% decrease in domestic violence.
This is an important thing to keep in mind, right? This is the Bureau of Justice Statistics. This is the bottom line in numbers for domestic violence nationally. This rate decrease is a very real thing, and it is a byproduct of the hard work of so many people in this room. And then you realize that things have kind of flattened off, actually, for a period of time. This also came because VAWA came around. That's when it began, right, in 1994. Huge investments, paying for specialized police, funding of advocacy, funding of all sorts of things. Funding makes a difference. Strong laws make a difference. We see that. When you look, and Chris is right, when you look at the studies on protection orders don't make anybody safe. They do make them a lot safer on average. They're a very useful tool. University of Washington has done great work with this. It's been replicated across the country. Protection orders are an amazing tool for a reduction in domestic violence in a community period. They are the what works. And now we know with that, if we can actually take the next step of removing firearms, which is this ever-increasing, difficult thing to respond to, it can make a real difference. Just like it has been done with strangulation. I mean, one of the things that most people don't know is the rate of strangulation as a percentage of deaths in the community has been falling dramatically, really since the 80s, but more aggressively since the passage of the strangulation law in the 2000s. That law, which made it a serious crime, had a huge impact. Yes, there are still a lot of deaths that are happening. All of them are tragic. Most of them right now are by gun. They're not by strangulation. In fact, I want to say last year in King County, we had no deaths by strangulation. It's a county of over 2 million people. It's a remarkable statistic. It used to be 25% of them.
And so the next clip I want to show you is basically, how far we've come. I think Dave's going to spend some time talking about how far we've come nationally and statewide, but how far we came from those review hearings that you saw, which were pretty sad. Two people there, the courts were like, what are we supposed to do? We're not really sure. We're taking this civil process in a very reactive criminal system and trying to figure out how to make it work. And it was incredibly confusing for everyone involved. And this is where we are.
On the March
Oh, sorry. I missed this part. We did talk about the test cases, but this is a quick clip about the test cases. It's only about a minute long.
On the March day that Michael Thomas appeared for his firearms hearing, he told the judge he had no guns, a conversation recorded by the court.
There was an allegation that you had a handgun.
We had a handgun years ago, and nobody, never seen any handguns on me.
Thomas signed this form swearing, "I do not have any firearms." But the one day that Michael Thomas appeared in court was unlike any other at the King County Courthouse.
And that was because we were there. And this is essentially how far it's come, that watching those review hearings in contrast to them.
There's an allegation that you had a weapon in your waistband. There's an allegation that you possessed a gun last year.
The petitioner indicated that he twice threatened to kill her with a gun, pointed it at her, and cocked it in front of her children.
What's happening in this King County courtroom is leading to more of these ending up in the police property room. These firearms belong to accused domestic abusers, many of whom tried to hide them from authorities.
So all of these guns were recovered either from a search warrant or by people that served the protection orders.
Sergeant Dorothy Kim of the Seattle Police Department's Domestic Violence Unit is part of a new task force hunting for guns that would have previously gone undetected.
What's the likelihood that any of these guns would have ended up in police hands?
None. None. A year ago, none of these guns would have been recovered. We would never have done the search warrant.
This is just about whether you have the guns. That's the only thing this is about.
Glad might read this out of that.
Okay.
Firearms hearings, like this one, specifically target people who are served with protection orders.
She indicated in the petition that he has a handgun that he keeps in a specific place in the house.
The police and prosecutors on the Regional Firearms Task Force interview victims and witnesses, and even obtain search warrants if needed to get at abusers' guns.
He had threatened her with a gun. The firearms are usually loaded. There's been threats to kill, strangulation, rape, stalking.
Instead of relying on the word of accused abusers, the court now hears evidence collected by the task force.
We also have information that there are 7 to 8 other guns at the property where he resides.
That's our crime scene analysis people to make sure that if we serve the search warrant that we have adequate resources to get everything out of there.
We're walking into a court hearing right now where a judge is going to determine whether a number of domestic violence suspects have to surrender their firearms. There are 24 that she's going to rule on today.
This is the hearing to make sure that they have complied with either surrendering their weapons or filing a declaration of non-surrender saying that they don't have any firearms or access to any firearms.
Have you had an opportunity to look at your order to surrender weapons, sir?
Yes, ma'am, I actually was out at the street.
On April 30th, 2018, you signed a declaration of non-surrender. Do you remember doing that, sir?
Yeah, I don't have any.
Is this your signature here, sir?
Yeah.
While in custody, Officer Nichols reported a statement. I'm going to blast that motherfucking apartment. I don't have a permit, but that doesn't mean I don't carry. Prior to this position, I was a trial attorney, did domestic violence cases. And so I dealt with the aftermath. The incident had already happened. Now the team has the opportunity to act before that something happens.
And that's essentially the culture of compliance that we're trying to enforce in King County. The tone has changed.
Right. And you can see the difference between local news and HBO. I mean, HBO makes it look so much cooler at the King County Courthouse. We laugh about that, with everybody's hair looks great. No, but I think, what it comes down to is this question of how you give life to these words on a piece of paper, right? The order says, right, that you're not supposed to have weapons. And Bill is right. Bill belonged to his profile. Bill's an amazing former assistant U.S. attorney, who was one of the prosecutors on the Pan Am down flight that happened decades ago. Really sophisticated lawyer that has made it his passion in retirement to represent victims of domestic violence. The struggle, right, is to do this at scale. right? It's okay to do it on every so often. Like, how do you scale this up and really do this? And that's the challenge that we are constantly working on. And you have to engage in risk assessment. You have to prioritize one order over another. You have to look at what is firearm positive, what is firearm negative. Our hope is to really, we've been building data streams, working with electronic records management to really try and scale this up. King County, we're talking about thousands of orders. And that's just in the county system. And then we have the city of Seattle is looped in, but we have 39 cities in King County. And how are we connecting all of them to make sure that we have a system that is fully functional? And you do that also with model policy. We didn't decide just to have a relationship with one another and doing it. We signed a contract. We signed a contract that we made promises to other agencies of what we were going to do. And we were really focused on this being a regional approach, and we're hoping a state approach. We've had such great partnerships and have learned so much from Spokane and from other places around the state of different ways to approach doing this, that it does come down to relationships. Those relationships have to be backed by formal agreements, and you have to prioritize, but creating teams of individuals that are coordinated and integrated, interjurisdictional, this is the issue of our day. We have to be able to execute and do this in a broad-ranging way, because when you look at firearms and domestic violence, we know from the research it is a certainty that more women will die.
And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention you saw the court coordinators, which is a position that we created as part of this team. They truly are, like, their ability to assess risk and to filter through thousands of protection orders and to bring those to the case staffing, this is what you saw where we're staffing cases, is the heart and soul of this unit. It's built around that workflow, and that these advocates, we have Sabbath and Teresa, really, like I said, the heart and soul of this unit. Without them, we could not do the work we do. Without their expertise, they're both trained advocates. Lorinda, as well, is always doing that, and everyone in the office is basically, we're applying and putting it into practice, and we're able to do a lot. And I think because of that, it's scalable. It's all about how much you want to, where you want to cut off the risk, which ones you want to focus on.
Right, and I think the great part has been because we did something and we had support from great groups like the Alliance for Gun Responsibility, really helping message that out, show people success, work and help facilitate, like what we're doing right now. We're all getting together, figuring out ways to advance these issues. Elected officials and stakeholders become committed to implementation. It doesn't just happen overnight. We're still going through it. We were meeting yesterday with the U.S. Attorney's Office, talking about the partnerships and looking at extremist individuals and other things. The day before with school districts, how we're intersecting with them and doing this entire thing. There are so many different relationships that have to form. The great part is our state legislature has really now again written more laws that need to be given life. We need to implement more and do training about that. And this is not just at the local level, at the federal level. What we have seen is much more understanding about the risk of firearms and the want to do something about it. We all get caught up in discussions about the Second Amendment and what can we do. I'll also say, I think others are going to play a video that we have of respondents later on in the day. We've reached out to local gun shops. We look at local gun shops as a way to intersect with people who are like responsible firearm owners and to communicate a message of what people's obligations are. And what we found is most really agree that domestic abusers, people who present an extreme risk to the community, they shouldn't have guns. They don't want them to have guns. So how can we work together to make sure that that happens? Education, understanding, relationships. Just a couple of other things. Yeah, a number of beneficial measures. Our colleague Kim Wyatt was here. Kim's in the back. We know things have changed in Washington, D.C. Kim went and testified before the United States Senate on the implementation of extreme risk protection orders nationally. And the great part is Kim talked about how those laws honor the Constitution, how we are standing in the shoes of families, just in the same way that we stand in the shoes of victims when we are doing these orders. We want people to be protected. And when you talk about the actual cases, that's when people's eyes get wide because they're not doing the work. When you sit down, you actually look at a protection order, you look at the allegations, you know you can do something about it if you had the right approach, the right people right there to do that.
These clips are related to, obviously, on the state level and the national level. There were 10 bills passed this year. We went to the signing on Monday, and I think the governor looked at Renee and said, like, well, I know who to talk to when I need a bill passed. And, you know, I'm sure it's some kind of record here in the state of Washington, but these are some clips from arguments about some of those bills. 1225 is really requiring officers at the scene of a domestic violence call to make inquiries about removing firearms and to remove those firearms. Of course, not violent Fourth Amendment, but if they have the opportunity to. But it kind of takes away a little discretion, but it makes it a priority for best practice.
Thank you, Madam President. I will agree with my colleague that domestic violence cases are messy, they're fluctuating, and they're very dangerous. But we also have to take a look at the history of domestic violence in this state and take a look at discretion. There's a reason why in this state there's a mandatory arrest law for domestic violence. Because at that time, there was a need for that discretion not to be there because women were dying. Because you would have law enforcement respond to a domestic violence scene and tell the guy to go take a walk. It was considered something that happened in a marriage, and these crimes were not taken seriously. So that discretion was removed, and we had mandatory arrest. We're at a point in here where this is not an academic discussion. Women are dying every day through the hands of their loved one. Not an academic discussion at all. They're dead. So yes, we are removing discretion here because once again, it is needed because the data from decades of work supports it.
Apologize for being late. Here we come to order. This hearing today is to examine red flag laws, or lack of a better term. We're trying to identify people in our communities that are exhibiting pretty extreme behavior in terms of mental health issues, where they become a danger to themselves and others, and allow law enforcement and sometimes family members to go to a court to say this person needs some help and we need to stop violence before it occurs. There will be a robust due process component. We'll have witnesses talk about the kind of due process you need to make such a determination. There are 15 states that have a form of this. And one of the reasons we're having this hearing is because of Senator Blumenthal. Nobody has been more passionate about trying to find a solution. It's not the solution that he would prefer sometimes. It's just doing something rather than doing nothing. Senator Durbin's been that way about immigration for years. So I really do believe that Senator Blumenthal, that after today we can sort of define the problem. That there are a lot of people may be worried, is the government going to come take your guns? And the answer is no. Nobody's going to come and take a gun from you. But there will be a process for law enforcement and family members to petition a court to say that somebody in your neighborhood or somebody down the street or across town is about to blow. So I'm a big fan of the Second Amendment. I own firearms and I try to be responsible in my ownership, but at the same time, every right has limits. That's why.
Good morning, Chairman Graham, Ranking Member Feinstein, and distinguished members of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify and for your leadership on this critical life-saving tool, extreme risk protection orders. My name is Kim Wyatt. I am a Senior Deputy Prosecuting Attorney from King County, Washington. For the past year, I've served as a firearms prosecutor in the Regional Domestic Violence Firearms Enforcement Unit, specifically as the Extreme Risk Protection Order prosecutor. My responsibilities are to advise and assist law enforcement and family members on all aspects of extreme risk protection orders, from the petitions to the court proceedings. And I can tell you this has been some of the most important and rewarding work of my career. You see, as a prosecutor, rarely, if ever, do we get the opportunity to intervene prior to the gun violence occurring. Instead, we react. We receive that incident report after the crime has occurred. My colleagues and I know we have few brief windows of opportunity to intervene to prevent future harm. This life-saving legislation creates one of those opportunities and allows much-needed intervention to prevent suicide, homicide, and other acts of community violence, while at the same time protecting people's constitutional rights with due process built in. Although all of these cases described above are factually different, there is a common thread. All involve someone experiencing a behavioral health crisis or exhibiting violent behavior and having access to firearms. What we have learned over the past year is that the time to act to prevent future tragedies is upon us. What we see in Washington State is that this law is working to save lives. Every state in this nation deserves to have this tool, the ability to react quickly to threats of suicide and homicide and prevent irreversible violence. This is what the public expects, and most importantly, deserves. Thank you.
And you have a specific team just designated for that, is that correct?
We do. We work on orders. We work on firearm enforcement with folks that are subject to other protective orders, so domestic violence, stalking, and sexual assault, and as well as extreme risk protection orders. Yes.
That's somewhat unique around the country.
It is.
I applaud you for it.
Thank you.
So we would rather not be unique. I'm really looking forward to spending time with you all today. I know Pierce County, the people down here will end up doing this better than we do. I know that, and I hope you do. So I hope you enjoyed the rest of today and think of very practical things that you can do here and do something. Thank you.